No.
Okay, if you want to go ahead.
Great. Good evening and welcome to tonight's Democracy Initiative Telephone Town Hall. I'm Marissa Brown, Executive Director of the Democracy Initiative, and I will be the moderator for tonight's event. Our country was founded on the belief that we are all created equal. Living up to this promise, ensuring that all Americans can vote, is an important part of our civic duty. On this call, you'll be learning about what's going on with our elections and voting in the United States. You'll be hearing from experts such as Miles Rappaport, President, Common Cause, Cornell Brooks, who's the President and CEO of the NAACP, Matthew McClellan, who's the Executive Director for the National Council of La Raza Action Fund, Catherine Culleton Gonzalez, who's an attorney with the Advancement Project, Chris Melody Fields Figueredo, who's the Director of Election Protection for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and Stacy Long Simmons, who's the Director of Public Policy and Government Affairs at the National LGBTQ Task Force. These experts will bring you up to date on what's happening in our elections, the challenges to voting many Americans face, and really importantly, what you can do about it. We'll begin in just a moment, and we're excited to have you join us tonight. Before we begin, I have a few quick points. Right now, we're in the process of calling out to thousands of people, which takes a minute or two, so just stay on the line and we'll be hearing from our speakers shortly. Also, tonight we want to hear from you. If you would like to ask a question or share your thoughts, please press 0 on your telephone keypad and you'll be connected directly with one of our volunteer operators. Again, press 0 to ask a question or make a comment. If you've just joined us, good evening and welcome. This is tonight's Democracy Initiative Telephone Town Hall about ensuring fair elections. I'm Marissa Brown of the Democracy Initiative, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's event. We'll begin in a moment. A few quick things to know. We're in the process of dialing out to thousands of people, so stay on the line, and we'll be hearing from our expert speakers soon. I know for a lot of us, voting is not that difficult. But as the world's leading democracy, it is important that we ensure that all Americans can cast a ballot. It should be simple for everyone to participate, and we will tell you how you can help. As I said before, tonight we want to hear from you in addition to our speakers. Just a reminder, if you would like to ask a question or share your thoughts, please press 0 on your telephone keypad, and you'll be connected directly with one of our volunteer operators. As you may know, in some states, unfair voting laws are being passed by politicians who are trying to manipulate the system for their own benefit. We need to make sure that all voters can vote. And we want you to volunteer to help by becoming a volunteer nonpartisan election monitor. One of our goals for tonight is to recruit election monitors across the country. To tell you a little bit about the Democracy Initiative, we bring together 50 organizations with over 35 million members who are all committed to ensuring America lives up to its promise. I would like to thank those organizations, and especially the Communications Workers of America, Public Citizen, Sierra Club, Common Cause, the NAACP, La Raza, the Advancement Project, and the National LGBTQ Task Force, whose members are all part of this call. As I said, this upcoming election will need your help to ensure that elections this November are fair and that everyone can vote. Would you be willing to help? Press 1 now if you would like to volunteer now to be a poll monitor, and if you would like to volunteer to be a poll monitor this November. Now let's hear from our first speaker, Miles Rappaport, who's the president of Common Cause. Miles?
Thanks, Marissa, and thanks to all the members of the Democracy Initiative who are on the call and all the people who have called in. We're coming into the final weeks of what is a really important election, and there's going to be plenty of drama around candidates and close races and ballot initiatives and all kinds of things that I think should attract a high turnout. Unfortunately, we're also going to have a kind of an unwanted kind of drama in whether or not people are going to be able easily and without harassment and without difficulty to cast their fundamental right in America, which is the right to vote. Unfortunately, in a number of states, we have a very confusing situation where laws have been passed to restrict the right to vote, to require voter identification, or to shorten the early voting periods, or to eliminate same-day registration, or all kinds of things that are making it confusing. To increase that confusion, many of these things are being fought in courts, and the ultimate outcome for the voters is not even yet certain. For instance, within hours of the Shelby decision last year, which eliminated the Justice Department ability to pre-clear a number of policies, several states went into action and passed discriminatory voter ID legislation. So we have a confusing legal environment and rules environment that people are going to face. In addition, we've also started to pick up that there are organized groups of, I'd call them voting vigilantes, who are thinking that they are going to monitor, take the role of monitor to ensure that nobody casts a vote unless they are absolutely certain that they have been vetted. That will be their public rationale. Privately, they want to make voting as intimidating and as difficult and as kind of uncertain and uneasy as possible. So between the legal environment that is complicated, the absence of the Justice Department's ability under Shelby to pre-clear many of these rules, and the possibility that we're going to see people at the polls whose aim is to depress the vote, that's a pretty concerning situation. I say concerning but not discouraging, because what it also means is that this is an area where we can do something about it. Between Common Cause and our election protection program, along with many of the other organizations that are on this call, we have the ability to push back and to make sure that the voters' experiences are good. So I think I'll back up what Marissa said earlier to say that anyone who can possibly volunteer to be a poll monitor, particularly in the states where there are uncertain voting environments, should really sign up. And we've made it technologically easy for you to do this in the call. So I think it's really important that all of us, all the organizations and every individual, get out there, be a poll monitor, make sure that people have an unimpeded right to vote. We have a lot of work to do over the long haul to make America's voting system more uniform, more accessible, more voter-friendly, more welcoming, and that's a long-term task. But the short-term task is to make sure that come the voting day on in November, that people have the best possible experience with the most possible information and the most possible resources to help them. And poll monitors that are trained and skilled and understand what the laws are and what voters are allowed to do will be essential to this process. So I want to end this just by saying Common Cause is proud to be part of the Democracy Initiative, proud to be part of the election protection movement, and very much interested in having as many of our members and of people who are on the call and others get involved as poll monitors come Election Tuesday.
Thanks, Miles. And I want to reiterate what you said in the sense that you're right. It's concerning, but it's not discouraging. There are things that we can do to push back. And I want to ask everyone on the call who would like to be a monitor for this year's election to go ahead and press 1. If you have a question or would like to make a comment, please press 0 on your telephone keypad. We're looking forward to answering questions live on the call, and we'd love to hear from you. Next, I was going to ask Cornell Brooks, who is the president of the NAACP, to tell us a little bit about his perspective. Cornell?
Thank you so much, Marissa. If you're just joining us, my name is Cornell William Brooks, and I'm president and CEO of the NAACP. We're here tonight because we believe that in the constellation of constitutional rights, voting is the North Star. It is the right upon which every right stands. It is the cornerstone of our democracy, and on November 4th, millions of Americans across the country will head to the ballot box to exercise this fundamental right. Now, for over a half a century, the NAACP has played a leading role in national efforts to stop the expansion of voter suppression and to expand the rights for all Americans. The NAACP's strategy to protect and expand voting rights for all Americans has elevated and kept the attack on voting rights in the forefront of the national debate and raised awareness at the state level. Now, in response to record turnout in 2008, we found ourselves and find ourselves facing a historic backlash. Attempts in dozens of states to roll back voting rights, particularly for communities of color. Since then, we've witnessed the most well-coordinated, well-funded, well-targeted assault on voting rights. Indeed, our Supreme Court in the Shelby versus Holder decision invalidated a key provision of the Voting Rights Act. And we stand today without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act, and as a consequence, states and localities now have the ability to restrict the right to vote, unchecked, unlimited, and indeed unconscionable. These new laws and attacks are the poll taxes of our day. After years of progress, we cannot allow those who wish to restrict the right to vote to be able to engage in this activity unchecked. We cannot allow voter restrictive measures that were attempted in 2011, 2012, and 2013 to stop us, just as we did not allow Jim Crow to stop us over 50 years ago. So many have fought and risked their lives for our right to vote, and it is time for this generation to stand up and to enlist in this fight to protect the right to vote. And so as a consequence, we're calling upon people from all across the country to volunteer to be a poll monitor in your community, to encourage members in your organizations to participate and vote in the 2014 elections. And finally, to get involved in local membership organizations to combat state rollbacks to voting rights. This is a moment. It's a historic moment. It is a moment of conscience, and it is a moment in which we're all being called upon to stand up and to stand for the right to vote. With that said, Marissa, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, I think that's exactly right. It is a moment of conscience, and it is a moment when we are being asked to stand up. I'm going to go to Sherry Smith from Columbus, Ohio, who has a question.
Yes.
Sherry?
Yes. I can go ahead and talk now?
Yes, please, Sherry. Why don't you ask your question?
I work at the polls every election. I'm a voting location manager, and I have seen discrepancies a lot of times where people will come in and they'll say, I did not vote by paper ballot. I mean, they didn't mail in their vote. They didn't do absentee ballot. But the books will say absentee ballot. We had a lot of that during the Obama election. We've had a lot of that in other elections, and a lot of people are angry with us, but there's nothing we can do. You know, I'm working for the board that day, but I mean, it's a lot of discrepancies. And so, I mean, what do? I tell the board, but I don't know if it's getting any resolution because I keep having the same problem each year. A lot of people come in and say they didn't vote. They didn't send in the absentee ballot.
Well, that's a really good question, and I'm going to ask Catherine Culleton Gonzalez to answer it, partly because she's a lawyer and she knows the answers to lots of questions. Kathy?
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually going to look on our website right now, www.advancementproject.org, and I am going to find our Ohio Palm card. So if you give me just a second, I know that that's a perennial problem in Ohio, and I really commend you for talking to the boards of elections. We have this in English and Spanish in a number of our states, and I guess the best thing to do on Election Day is also to tell folks that if they haven't voted their absentee ballot, that they should be able to vote a regular ballot, and if for some reason the BOE doesn't let them do that, they should vote a provisional ballot, but only as a last resort. Many states have more generous rules than Ohio does about absentee ballots. But this year it's even more complicated because all registered voters have received an absentee ballot in the mail in Ohio. So they should only complete and return it if they want to vote absentee by mail. by that being sent out, we also hope that this year the boards of elections will be a little bit more generous when people come in and say, I didn't receive an absentee ballot, I didn't vote an absentee ballot, I want to vote. They should be able to vote under the Help America Vote Act. They have to be able to vote at least a provisional ballot if they say that they haven't voted their absentee ballot. So I would just try to get as many people to vote as possible. And please take a look on our website for these materials and be in touch.
Thank you, Catherine. I want to remind people that one of the things we're trying to do is on Election Day have people at the polling places who know some of the answers to this and certainly know who to call. So again, I'd ask you to press 1 if you would like to volunteer to be a monitor on Election Day or during the early voting period. And with that, I was going to ask Matthew from the National Council of La Raza to tell us a little bit about what you think about voting and what's happening from your perspective.
Sure. Thank you very much. For those of you just joining, this is Matthew McClellan. I am the Executive Director of the National Council of La Raza Action Fund. And I wanted to talk briefly about the importance of Latinos to have full and unencumbered access to the polls on Election Day and for places where we have early voting. There are a lot of pundits and naysayers out there who say that Latinos simply don't turn out in midterm elections, and I think that we all know that that's not the case. And we don't want the narrative on November 5th to be that Latinos didn't turn out. So we've, and in the last 10 to 15 years, the Latino community has made great strides and great gains in electoral power. And the only way to continue that is to go vote and also to protect our vote. So tonight we're talking about what we can do to volunteer, and we need all Latinos on this call to step up and help protect our community's right and ability to vote without any obstacles across the nation. In states like Colorado, Texas, New Mexico, California, and Florida, the Latino vote is a powerhouse. There's no denying the power of the Latino vote there, and we need to make sure that we protect every single registered and eligible voter's right to vote in those states. But even in states like North Carolina and Ohio, where our community is a little bit smaller and just emerging, there are races that are extremely close, and the Latino vote will be pivotal in those races, and protecting access to the ballot box is critical. So again, we ask the people, I believe it's hit 1 to volunteer and to step up and to help protect the Latino community. And with ongoing fights that we talked about earlier over onerous voter ID laws in states like Texas, there's bound to be confusion on Election Day as to just what we actually need to bring with us to be allowed to vote. And there's always the very high likelihood that with this added confusion, there's going to be some equal language access barriers that will be an even bigger issue because of all the complications. Because of this, we must help our community and protect their access to the voting, to the ballot box, and to vote unencumbered on Election Day and where early voting takes place. So this is just a plea to all of our Latino friends on the phone tonight to step up and volunteer nationwide. It's a very I believe you'll get free training and everything will be very clear on what you need to do. And we just ask that everyone step up. Don't let the gains we've made in the last 15 to 20 years get eroded by people who want to keep Latinos and people of color from voting nationwide. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matthew. Hey, I wanted to tell everybody that so far we've had 13,040 people join us tonight on this phone call, and we're very excited. We already have 112 volunteers to help poll monitor, and we're hoping to get more than that, so as many as possible. And I think Matthew's right in saying it's important that we protect this. As I said at sort of the opening of the call, really when you think about America and what our democracy is about, it's really about the idea, the promise that we're all equal. And voting is really the way that we show that. And we at the Democracy Initiative are working with a large coalition of organizations in the Democracy Initiative, but with another coalition, the Election Protection Coalition. And I want to turn to the director of the Election Protection Coalition, Chris Melody Fields Figueiredo, who can tell us a little bit more about what it means to monitor the election and what election protection is all about. Chris?
Thanks, Marissa. And I'm actually the manager of legal mobilization at the Lawyers Committee, but I also co-lead the Election Protection Coalition with my colleague, Marcia Johnson Blanco. And so happy to join all of you guys, and each of the speakers tonight are members, their organizations are member of the Election Protection Coalition, and I just want to thank everyone that has gotten on the phone this evening. 13,000 is a great number, and it really is, working in collaboration with all of you on the ground is going to make sure that we protect the right to vote in this election and every election moving forward. You guys are really critical in this fight. So Election Protection is the largest nonpartisan coalition in the country. There are a number of organizations that are a member of the coalition, and we're working together throughout the entire year to protect the right to vote. We recruit both attorneys and citizen poll monitors, both to protect the right to vote and monitor issues that arise before Election Day and on Election Day as well. There are two critical components of election protection. One is the 1-866 Our Vote hotline, which is live now through Election Day. Any voter, any of you on the phone today, if you go to the polls and have problems or have questions ahead of Election Day, call the 1-866 Our Vote hotline. Tweet about it, put it on a Facebook post, put it in your community bulletins, and let everybody know that this is a resource for them if they have any questions or problems about voting. It's also connected to provide services in multiple languages through the 1-888 Vota hotline, which is through the NetLeo Educational Fund, and the 1-888 API Vote, which provides services in multiple Asian languages. So that is live throughout from now until Election Day. We've been getting a ton of calls from folks in Georgia, unclear about their voter registration status, obviously from Texas, of folks that are unclear about the status of the voter ID law there. So it is really, truly a critical resource. Through the early vote period, we have both citizen and attorneys monitoring polling locations and responding to issues through the early voting period. And then on Election Day, we'll have both attorneys and citizens monitoring issues at the polls in about 20 to 25 states. So you guys are going to be incredibly important to work with Election Protection to report issues as you see them at the polls. So I encourage you guys to volunteer and sign up to be a citizen poll monitor. You guys are incredibly important to this work, and we can't do it without you.
Thanks, Chris. You're exactly right. We can't do it without the people on this call, and we do need hundreds of volunteers around the country, particularly in the areas where we're concerned that there might be issues. I did want to answer a few of the questions. Let me just remind people that if you do want to volunteer, you can press 1. And to be clear, when you press 1, you will be put into a program in your locality. This is not something, we're doing it, we're recruiting people nationally, but all of this work takes place on the ground in a place, whether it's Texas or Ohio or Georgia or North Carolina or Wisconsin, or California. These are all places where there will be election protection efforts and there will be citizen poll monitors, and you can volunteer. I did want to go to one of the questions we have from the phones. Could I go to Andrea from North Carolina? I'm not sure who's going to be the best person to answer your question necessarily, Andrea, but I'd love to hear it.
Yes, I was asking, is it illegal for the Republican Party to send out false information stating that the election day is like on November the 5th instead of November the 4th, or sending information that telling you the wrong place to go vote, or if you're eligible to vote?
I can take this. So this is Chris from the Lawyers Committee. So that is called deceptive practices. It's an issue that both Common Cause and the Lawyers Committee have worked very closely together and helped propose legislation both on the national level and the state level as well. The laws are different according to state if there is a state action that can be taken, and if that deceptive information is is broadcast. But what's really critical, and one of the things we did in 2012 in North Carolina, there were deceptive phone calls telling people that they could vote by phone. As that information comes, reporting that to the hotline, and all of us out on the phone have done, calls into the community to correct that misinformation. I don't know the specific statutes in North Carolina, but the critical thing is tracking down who is distributing that deceptive information, so we can take action.
Great. We have another question, which is from Adela Aguilar in Houston, Texas. Adela?
Yes, yes, hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi.
Thank you.
Yes, I was wondering about the deaf community. I recently have befriended the deaf community, and I was wondering, are there any activities or progresses that include them and help them with the voting process or try to bring them into the voting process?
I can take that also. This is Chris Fields from the Lawyers Committee. So there's the National Disability Rights Network that has what they call P&As in almost every, I believe every state that work locally with deaf and hard of hearing communities and other disability communities to help them on voting issues. I'm going to look up the specific contact information for Texas. But they are part of the coalition, and they are working with those communities to make sure. There's one key provision for those that have disabilities is Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act that allows you to bring someone to the polls to help you, and that is nationwide.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for the question. I want to remind people, these are the kinds of questions people do have on Election Day, and the kinds of things that you can do to help include pressing 1 to volunteer to be a monitor on Election Day and help us help voters make sure that they can vote. And I want to have one more question. I have Christopher from Stone Mountain, Georgia. Christopher, could you ask?
Yes.
Could you hear me? Great. Tell us your question.
Yeah, I can. My question is about the transgender voters. I got my name changed about 2 years ago, and I'm trying to figure out how I can get back to being able to vote, because I've moved since then too. And I registered with Georgia Equality at one of our Pride events.
Great, and I'm going to ask Stacy Long Simmons. Stacy, can you help Christopher?
Sure, I can certainly talk a bit about what Christopher is raising, which is the issue of being transgender and wanting to vote without having any hindrances when you show up at the polls. And while I don't know the specific laws of Georgia, I defer to some of the other folks who are on the phone for that. I just want to acknowledge that oftentimes there are questions that come up when you present with identification, and some misinformed poll workers may use all kinds of reasons. Either they're suspicious about the ID, they're suspicious about someone's appearance and what they might see on the ID, or in some instances people aren't even able to have the required ID that's required in order for them to show up and vote, because the laws have been changed in different jurisdictions requiring photo ID. But I just want to affirm your willingness to exercise your right to vote, and just ask that you be cognizant of the 866 Our Vote hotline, so that if you have any problems, you definitely are able to pick up the phone and call right then and there to be able to talk to folks who are waiting to stand by to hear about any situations where people are being obstructed at the polls.
Thank you, Stacy, and thanks for the question. I think, anybody on the call can tell we have lots of different constituencies and different questions coming from different folks. This is what happens on Election Day, and it happens in the election, sort of the lead up to election. Lots of people who have moved, don't know if they can vote, changes in their life. These are things that election monitors can follow up with, and know about. So if you would like to help, please press 1. We'll make sure you're put into a program where you're recruited and trained and deployed on either through early voting or on election day, so you can really help people with these kinds of issues. So with that said, I did want to go to Kathy Culleton-Gonzalez, who knows a lot about what's happened legally. And Catherine, can you tell us a little bit about what's happened recently and what people should know about in terms of voting?
Sure. There's been a lot of litigation. There's been a lot of recent litigation. So we won in Wisconsin, and there's no voter ID in November in Wisconsin. In Texas, that case was won and then overturned by the Fifth Circuit. So as of now, there is voter ID in Texas. We litigated with the North Carolina NAACP and many other groups against North Carolina's comprehensive voter suppression bill, and we were unable to stop those provisions from going into place in this November. In Ohio, the ACLU won a really good case against cuts to early voting and same-day registration. They won on appeal, and the Supreme Court actually overturned that for this November. So those are some of the big cases, and my dear friend Chris actually just told me that about an hour before this call that a case was won in Arkansas, so there's no voter ID in Arkansas. It's all changing very, very quickly, and it can be really confusing. And it's really similar to what we went through in 2012. We beat voter ID in Pennsylvania in 2012, and yet and still on election day there were problems. Some of the problems that happen also are racial justice issues. So I'm with Advancement Project and really, really honored to be with this wonderful, esteemed panel and be part of Democracy Initiative and Election Protection. And I'm the director of Voter Protection. We're a national racial justice group, but we're voting rights nerds, and we're all proud to be voting rights nerds. And I think that just by being on this call, everyone who's listening is a voting rights nerd. When we look at the top issues in our country, and I've been practicing civil and human rights law for 20 years, I've learned how critical voting rights are, as Mr. Brooks said, and they're trying to take them away because they're fundamental to everything else. So a lot of it is in reaction to changing demographics and some of the folks who you all are trying to organize and trying to help vote. For example, I'm from an immigrant household, and I know that we'll never change anything about how immigrants are treated unless communities of color can truly exercise their political power in what's supposed to be a democracy. The war on voting is really a backlash against quote-unquote changing demographics. It's taking us back to the days of Jim Crow laws in quite obvious ways. So we and our allies have been litigating on behalf of Black and Latino voters against strict voter ID laws. They're, for all practical purposes, a poll tax. We know they impact women, low-income voters, and many others as well. So I know you're busy, and I only have 3 minutes, and there are a lot of people on this call. So first, I want to remind you to hit number 1 to volunteer. Your work on Election Day is absolutely critical to making sure that people can vote. And then the other thing I'm going to ask you is to please follow all of us on Twitter. You can follow me. You can follow everybody else on this call on Twitter. You can follow Advancement Project. My handle is @KathyCulletonGZ, and you can also follow us at @ADV_project. If you don't tweet, you can get on our website and see our materials, and our phone number is 202-728-9557, and you can always reach us through the R vote too if it's something that we're assigned to do in the coalition. If you follow us on Twitter, you'll be the first to know when we win a case, like we just did in Wisconsin, and you'll know that voter ID is no longer needed, or when we lose a case and we have to keep on fighting back, as just happened in North Carolina. And I want to be clear, when we lose, it's a setback, but you need to know what the rules are and what's at stake. We also need to build a voting rights movement to keep on fighting back. So as you talk to voters, you'll know what the rules are, and you'll know how to help fight voter suppression and to build a voting rights movement. Whatever we can't fix now, we need to litigate it and fix it before 2016. I know voting has become really complicated, and there are forces out there that want to make it hard, and our job is to understand it and break down the barriers, but I think that's not impossible. So please stay in touch. We can give you the tools to make sure that happens. And I just also want to run through 5 things, really quick things that we all can do to protect voting rights between now and 2016. Number 1, be aware. Number 2, advocate. Number 3, litigate and communicate. Get the word out about it. Number 4, be bilingual. It's one of the most important things we can do is to have our materials and our information in multiple languages. People who do not speak English very well are going through a literacy test if they have to vote in English only, and bilingual materials actually increases access by up to 40% among voters of color. And then number 5, what you're doing right now, be part of running elections. It's a democracy, and we need to make it ours too.
Thanks, Kathy. And I'm going to add one more, which is press 1 to volunteer to be part of our democracy. And just to make sure people understand, when you do press 1, what will happen is in the next week, someone in your community who's running an election protection program, who is recruiting and deploying nonpartisan citizen volunteers to monitor the election will contact you, make sure you're trained, and make sure that you have what you need in order to be a successful monitor of the elections. We talk all the time when we talk about what a great democracy we have. Often we send election monitors overseas. Often we need that here too. We need people who are watching what happens, understanding what happens, and really helping voters. And that's what election monitors are able to do. I wanted to go to one more question, which is I have Andrew Bennett from Sylvania, Ohio. Andrew, are you still on?
Hello.
Hi, Andrew. Welcome.
Hi. Okay.
Do you have a question for us?
I do. So, in Ohio, I can't vote yet, but I'm working at the Youth at the Booth program. So I'm already going to be at the polls helping people figure out how to use, like, the voting equipment. Is there anything else I can do to help? Or help?
Sure. Cornell Brooks, could you tell Andrew, who's obviously already a good citizen, although perhaps not old enough to vote yet, what else he could be doing to help? I think Cornell may have be on mute. But that said, Marilyn from Common Cause, I know you're on. Maybe you could tell us something about what Andrew could do to help.
Sure. One thing that Andrew can do, there are a number of states that are doing making sure that people have the information about the 866 Our Vote hotline. If you go to the 866 Our Vote website, you can download information about what's happening in your state and make sure that that those who are eligible to vote in Pennsylvania have the information. There are palm cards in various states that you can try to just make copies of and send out emails to your friends, put on Facebook, all the information about the 866 Our Vote hotline. So the more you communicate and share information, the better everyone will be on Election Day.
And I'll piggyback off of Marilyn. I think especially because you'll be inside the polls, reporting issues that you may see to the 1-866 Our Vote. But, the work doesn't end on Election Day. The work continues. And, all of us that are on the phone speaking tonight, we're, of course, tracking these issues in the lead up to the election and on Election Day. But the real work starts the day after to make sure that we can fix these problems that continue to occur every year, expand the right to vote, and expand access and opportunities to vote. And so, because you're already civically engaged and working at the polls, we really need people like you that work in partnership with us to move the ball forward so we can make sure that every eligible voter has the right to vote.
And this is Matthew McClellan with the NCLR Action Fund. I'd like to make one final suggestion to our young person who maybe can't vote yet. What I did when I was your age was I also was a volunteer at the polling places. It's great to hear that young people still love this stuff. But bring a friend or recruit as many people you know your age to do this, because really the earlier we start, the more likely we are to stay engaged in this. And so talk to your high schools or your school civics club or what other organizations you're a member of, or just bring a friend along with you to volunteer outside of the poll. Just the more people we get involved, especially at a young age, the more likely we are to have a more solid democracy and a more solid system going forward.
Thanks. And I just want to remind people. So I have some access to some data here, and I know that a lot of people who are listening to this call have been listening for a while, and I really appreciate that. And I know that some of you, if we could just get 6 more people, we could get 10% of the people who are on this call to have volunteered. And I just want to make sure that we've asked it one more time. If you would like to volunteer, please press 1. Someone from your community will call you, and they will make sure that you know everything you need to know to be an election monitor. And it would just be a few hours, either early voting before the election or on election day. So we would really appreciate it if you can do that. And I would like to go to Stacy Long Simmons, who has been very patient in waiting her turn to talk. And Stacy, can you tell us a little bit about your perspective on voting and what people need to hear?
Sure. Thank you so much. For those of you just joining, I'm from the National LGBTQ Task Force, and we're deeply troubled by what's been happening over the last few years as states across the country continue to throw up so many roadblocks to voting. And requiring voters to present identification is a significant obstacle for members of the LGBTQ community, especially those who are trans and gender nonconforming. The Williams Institute estimates that strict voter ID requirements may have actually disenfranchised over 25,000 transgender voters in just 9 states during the 2012 election cycle. And a third of transgender people report being unable to update any of their identity documents or records. And transgender people generally experience difficulty voting in 3 main areas. They may have gender or other discrepancies on their IDs, so a misinformed poll worker can believe that their ID is invalid or suspicious and try to keep them from being able to vote. There may be encountering unfair suspicion or discrimination that's solely based on their appearance. So even where a voter has a consistent and up-to-date name and gender information on their ID, a poll worker may still feel like they can challenge transgender person about the accuracy of their ID, and it's solely just based on discrimination based on their appearance. And then finally, a lack of the actual required ID, because many trans and gender nonconforming people experience higher rates of poverty and unemployment and discrimination, and so they are disproportionately likely to not have any sort of photo ID at all. And so I was going to share a story about Jordan Hansen, who is a transgender woman who's fearing that she will be disenfranchised in the upcoming election cycle. She's a resident of Kansas. She's older than 18 and has registered to vote and does have an official government-issued photo ID, but the sex field on her driver's license is listed as male. And while Ms. Hansen has tried to change her driver's license, she was turned away because they then told her she needed to change her birth certificate first. And so then when she tried to change the sex on her birth certificate, she was told that was impossible because of some state Supreme Court case. So poll workers were not instructed to consider sex in assessing the validity of a photo ID, but transgender voters have reported experiencing problems with and having to actually find themselves in the position of educating poll workers on sex discrepancies on their ID, and even having to sometimes explain what transgender means. So it's no wonder that many transgender people simply stay home and give up their right to vote rather than face discrimination at the polls. And we know that the transgender community is not the only group that's disenfranchised by these laws. I mean, we've been talking this evening about the different groups: women, older adults, immigrants, people who live in poverty, communities of color. Anyone who has a largely transient life as well are just significantly more likely to have identification that isn't current or isn't acceptable in the eyes of the poll worker. So the task force, we're committed to preserving access to democracy for all and fighting against restrictive voting laws and ensuring that each and every one of us can have access to the electoral process. And so we've said it once, we're going to say it again. Please press 1 to volunteer to be a poll monitor in your local community and be engaged. Register to vote in the 2014 elections. And visit thetaskforce.org for more information about our work on these important issues. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank everyone who has both presented on the call and participated in the call. We are up to 150 volunteers. 151, 152, who have volunteered to be election monitors on Election Day or during early voting, and we really appreciate that. As I said at the outset of the call, and as Cornell Brooks said, this is a moment of conscience. This is about our democracy and about the promise that our founders really felt when they made this country, that we are equal, that everyone has a voice. And I believe really strongly that that is something that we all should be working for, and it's part of our civic duty to both vote and to make sure everyone can vote. So I thank you for volunteering, and I thank you for participating in the call. And if you have more questions, I think people have put out a lot of websites and information for you to follow up with, and we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.